The whisper of a forgotten legend. The silent expanse of deep space carried 1,000 untold stories, and among them was the tale of the human, the last warrior of a nearly extinct race. Captain Leora Vesh stared out from the bridge of her sleek starship, Viruna's Edge, her gaze locked on the shimmering cascade of the Oscara Nebula. For years, whispers had followed her through the corridors of power and back-alley trading posts. A human had survived the cataclysm that scattered their kind, and she was determined to find him. "Captain, we're approaching the coordinates," said Nyx, her ship's eye. Its voice was smooth, as though a whisper in a dream. Leora leaned forward, her cobalt-blue fingers brushing the panel to zoom in on the projected star chart. The destination loomed, a desolate moon on the fringes of the Oscara Nebula, barely a speck of life among the debris of forgotten wars. "You're sure the intel is solid?" she asked, her voice sharp, tinged with suspicion. Years of chasing false leads had left her wary of hope. "As certain as the traders were," Nyx replied. "The human was sighted entering an old mining outpost 3 cycles ago." Her heart thudded in her chest. A human. Not a ghost, not a rumor, but a living remnant of the species that had once dominated the stars. Leora adjusted her violet combat vest, a relic of her years in the Xeric fleet. She wasn't here for glory. She wasn't here to hunt. She was here to understand. Landing on the forgotten moon. The Viruna's Edge touched down on the moon's cracked, lifeless surface with a low whine of stabilizers. A faint atmosphere hung over the barren landscape, thick enough to breathe but thin enough to chill her lungs. Leora stepped out, her boots crunching against the dry, mineral-encrusted ground. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the wind sweeping over jagged rocks. Ahead stood the remnants of a mining outpost, its once glorious spires now reduced to rusted skeletons. The place felt abandoned, save for the faint glow of a single window in the largest structure. Leora's fingers brushed the hilt of her plasma staff as she approached. The quiet unease of the place tugged at her instincts, honed from decades of survival in the galaxy's darkest corners. She pushed the heavy steel door open, its creak echoing through the cavernous hall within. "Who's there?" A voice called from the shadows. It was gruff, weathered, human. She froze, scanning the dim interior. A figure emerged, tall and lean, wearing a patchwork of armor that had clearly seen better days. His face was shadowed, but his piercing blue eyes cut through the gloom like twin stars. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "And you are," she replied, her own tone calm but firm. The man stepped closer, his face now visible under the flickering light. His features were sharp, his dark hair streaked with gray, and his presence radiated the kind of strength only forged through relentless hardship. "They call me Elias Kane," he said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "But I suspect you already know that." The moment of truth. Leora held his gaze, her mind racing with questions. For so long, she had imagined this moment, prepared for it. But now that it was here, she found herself uncharacteristically unsure. What could she say to a man whose existence defied all odds? "I didn't come here to fight," she said at last, her voice steady. "I came here to learn." Elias chuckled dryly, crossing his arms. "Learn what?" "How to survive. Because I'm not exactly in the teaching business." "Not survival," Leora replied. "Resilience. Humans have become a myth, a cautionary tale told across the galaxy. And yet here you are." Elias's smirk faded, replaced by something deeper, a flicker of pain, perhaps even regret. "You don't know what you're asking," he said. "What it took to stay alive. What I've lost." "Then tell me," she pressed, stepping closer. "Because the galaxy is on the brink of another war, and I need to understand what makes humans different." Elias studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching hers. Finally, he sighed, the weight of the years evident in his posture. "All right, Captain," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." As they stood in the dim light of the ruined outpost, Leora knew that she had just opened a door to something far greater than she had ever imagined. A story that would change the course of the galaxy itself. The hunter becomes the hunted. The faint hiss of pressurized air filled the room as Elias Kane sealed the chamber door behind them. Inside, the mining outpost's central hub flickered with half-dead holograms, their once vivid displays reduced to ghostly images of maps and equipment schematics. Lyora's boots echoed against the metal floor as she surveyed the space. It was a far cry from the grand military installations she was used to, but it exuded a quiet resilience, much like the man before her. Elias moved with the ease of someone who had spent years surviving in the shadows. His eyes scanned the room as if he expected danger to materialize from the walls. "You shouldn't have come here," he said bluntly, his voice low but firm. "I didn't have much of a choice," Leora replied. "You're not easy to find." "That's the point," he shot back, folding his arms. "People who look for me usually bring trouble." She raised an eyebrow. "And yet, you let me walk in here." Elias smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I was curious. Not many people come this far unless they're desperate or stupid." Leora stepped closer, her gaze unwavering or determined. "A deal in the dark." Elias leaned against a battered console, his posture casual but his eyes razor-sharp. "All right, Captain," he said, his tone laced with skepticism. "You came all this way. What do you want from me?" "I need to understand what makes humans different," Leora said, her voice steady. "Your kind was nearly wiped out, yet you survived. Thrived, even. Why?" He chuckled, a bitter sound that echoed in the hollow chamber. "You think we thrived? Lady, we're a cautionary tale told to scare alien kids at bedtime. And yet you're still here," she countered, "a relic of a species that refused to vanish. That means something." Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his dark, graying hair. "You want answers? Fine. But they come with a price." "What kind of price?" Leora asked, narrowing her eyes. "I've got enemies," he said simply. "A lot of them. You stick around me long enough. You'll meet them, help me deal with them, and maybe I'll tell you what you want to know." The first attack. Before Leora could respond, a distant rumble shook the outpost, followed by the sharp whine of energy weapons discharging outside. Elias's demeanor changed in an instant, his casual stance replaced by the coiled tension of a predator ready to strike. "They found me," he muttered, grabbing a rifle from a hidden compartment in the wall. "Who?" Leora demanded, drawing her plasma staff. "Take your pick," he said grimly. "Mercenaries, bounty hunters, maybe a few old friends with grudges. Doesn't matter. They all want the same thing. Me dead." Leora followed him to the door, her mind racing. She hadn't expected action this quickly, but she wasn't about to back down. "What's the plan?" "Plan's simple," Elias said, peeking through a crack in the door. "We fight." Outside, the barren moon was alive with chaos. Shadows flitted between the jagged rocks, and the faint glow of energy rifles lit up the dark landscape. A group of armed aliens moved toward the outpost, their movements precise and coordinated. Leora and Elias exchanged a glance, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Without another word, they launched into action. A lesson in resilience. Elias moved like a man who had fought 1,000 battles. His shots were precise, each one finding its mark with deadly efficiency. Leora couldn't help but be impressed as she fought alongside him, her plasma staff whirling in arcs of deadly energy. "You fight well," she said, dispatching a charging mercenary with a swift strike. "You haven't seen anything yet," he replied, ducking behind cover to reload. The attackers were relentless, but so were Leora and Elias. They fought with the desperation of those who had everything to lose and nothing to prove. For every alien that fell, another seemed to take its place, but the pair held their ground, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost natural. As the dust settled and the last of the attackers retreated, Leora leaned against a rock, catching her breath. That was intense. Elias nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. Welcome to my world. The bond forged in battle. Back inside the outpost, the adrenaline still coursed through Leora's veins as she watched Elias inspect his rifle. So, she said, breaking the silence, "Is this what you meant by your enemies?" "This," he replied, gesturing to the chaos outside. "This is a quiet day." Leora couldn't help but smile. Despite his gruff exterior, there was something undeniably compelling about Elias Kane. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter, a symbol of human resilience in its purest form. "You still haven't answered my question," she said after a moment. "Why do humans survive?" Elias looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Because we have to," he said simply. "Because no matter how bad things get, no matter how many times we're knocked down, we get back up. That's just who we are." Leora nodded, his words resonating deeply within her. She had come to this desolate moon seeking answers, and she had found them, in the form of a man who refused to give up. And she realized she wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not when there was so much more to learn. Secrets of the Survivor. The dim light of the outpost's central chamber flickered as Elias Kane methodically cleaned his rifle, his movements steady and practiced. Leora watched him from across the room, leaning against a rusted console. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the barren moon had returned to its desolate stillness, the earlier battle now just a memory etched into the dust. "You're different," she said finally, her voice breaking the quiet. Elias didn't look up. "You're not the first to say that." "I mean it," she pressed. "You didn't just survive back there. You led. You adapted. That's not something you see in just any species." He paused, setting the rifle aside. "Survival doesn't come with instructions," he said, his voice low. "You do what you have to. Learn fast or die faster." "But there's more to it than that," Leora said, stepping closer. "There's something in you, in humans, that refuses to break. I've seen other species fold under pressure, but you fight like it's in your blood." Elias finally met her gaze, his blue eyes sharp and guarded. "It's not just the blood. It's the scars. A glimpse of the past." He stood, walking toward a cracked viewport overlooking the moon's bleak surface. "You want to know why humans survive? It's because we had no choice. Back on Earth, before it all went to hell, we thought we were invincible. We built cities that touched the sky, conquered diseases that used to wipe us out, and sent ships to every corner of the stars. But then we hit the wall." "The wall?" Leora asked, tilting her head. "Resource wars, climate collapse, corporate greed. Take your pick," Elias said bitterly. "We tore ourselves apart. By the time we realized what we were doing, it was too late. The planet turned against us, and the lucky ones were the first to leave." He glanced back at her. "The rest of us, we had to fight for every breath, every drop of water, every patch of ground. Earth didn't just make us strong. It forced us to be." Leora's chest tightened. She had heard stories of Earth's fall, but hearing it from someone who had lived it was different. "And you?" she asked softly. "What did you lose?" Elias's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, he said, "Everything. My family, my friends, my home. But the worst part wasn't losing them. It was surviving when they didn't. A new purpose." The weight of his words hung in the air, but Leora wasn't ready to let the conversation end. "And now you're here," she said. "Alive. Fighting. Why?" Elias smirked, though it was devoid of humor. "You make it sound noble. Truth is, I'm just trying to stay one step ahead of everyone who wants me dead." "But it's more than that," she pressed. "You're not just surviving. You're pushing back." He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I am," he admitted. But if you're looking for some grand mission or higher purpose, you're barking up the wrong tree." "Then let me give you one," Leora said, her voice firm. "The galaxy is on the brink of another war. Whole civilizations are at risk. I need someone who knows how to survive, someone who can teach others how to fight back." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's me?" "I know it is," she replied without hesitation. "You've lived through the worst. You've seen what happens when everything falls apart. That makes you exactly what we need." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a dry laugh. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. A dangerous alliance." Before Leora could respond, a sudden alert blared through the outpost, a harsh mechanical screech that sent shivers down her spine. "Proximity sensors," Elias muttered, already moving toward the console. "Someone's coming." Leora followed, her plasma staff in hand. "More bounty hunters." "Worse," he said grimly as he tapped at the screen. A grainy image flickered to life, showing a fleet of sleek, black ships descending toward the moon's surface. Black Veil Syndicate. Leora's blood ran cold. The Black Veil was infamous, a shadowy organization that specialized in capturing rare and valuable beings across the galaxy. A human would be their ultimate prize. "They're here for you," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "No kidding," Elias replied, already strapping on his gear. "They don't stop. They don't negotiate. And they don't leave witnesses." Leora's mind raced. They couldn't stay and fight. Not against those odds. "We need to leave. Now." Elias glanced at her, his expression hard but resolute. "You're right. But if we're leaving, we're not doing it quietly." The escape plan. The two of them moved quickly through the outpost, gathering supplies and arming themselves for the inevitable confrontation. Elias led her to a hidden hangar where a battered but functional starship rested, its hull scarred from countless battles. "This isn't exactly luxury transport," Leora said, eyeing the ship. "It'll fly," Elias replied. "And right now, that's all that matters." As they prepped the ship for launch, the sound of boots echoed through the corridors outside. The Black Veil was closing in. Leora tightened her grip on her plasma staff, her heart pounding in her chest. "You ready for this?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the danger. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't," she replied. The ship's engines roared to life, and as the first of the Black Veil operatives burst into the hangar, Leora and Elias unleashed a storm of firepower. Together, they fought their way to the ship, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost natural. As the ship lifted off, Leora caught a glimpse of the Black Veil's leader standing in the chaos below, a shadowy figure watching them with cold, calculating eyes. "This isn't over," she muttered as they soared into the stars. Elias glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "It never is." And with that, they disappeared into the void, their fates bound together by a shared purpose neither fully understood yet. Into the abyss. The stars blurred into streaks of light as the ship jumped to hyperspace, leaving the barren moon and the Black Veil Syndicate in its wake. Leora leaned back in her seat, her breath still catching from the intensity of their escape. The cockpit was small and cramped, illuminated by the dim glow of control panels. Elias sat in the pilot's chair, his hand steady on the controls, his gaze fixed on the endless void ahead. "You're awfully quiet," Leora remarked, breaking the tense silence. Elias didn't look at her. "Thinking. About the Syndicate," she guessed. "About what comes next," he corrected, his voice calm but resolute. "They won't stop coming. Not for me. And now not for you." She folded her arms, meeting his gaze as he turned to face her. "You think I didn't know what I was signing up for?" He smirked faintly. "I think you underestimate just how bad this can get." The Black Veil's shadow. The ship's eye chimed, interrupting their conversation. Incoming transmission detected. Source unknown. Elias stiffened, his hand moving to the console. "Let's see who's knocking." The screen flickered to life, revealing a shadowy figure cloaked in darkness. The voice that followed was smooth, almost mocking. Elias Kane, Captain Leoravesh, you've made quite a mess. Who the hell are you? Leora demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for her plasma staff. You may call me Oron, the figure said, ignoring her tone. You've interfered with syndicate operations, and now there's a substantial price on your heads. Surrender, and perhaps I'll make your deaths painless. Elias leaned closer to the screen, his expression unreadable. Not interested. The figure's tone turned cold. You'll regret this. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the cockpit in silence. Leora turned to Elias, her jaw clenched. Who is this Oron? High-ranking operative in the syndicate, Elias replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Smart, ruthless, and very good at his job. Wonderful, Leora muttered. Any bright ideas? Yeah, Elias said, rising from his seat. We go dark. A hidden refuge. Elias guided the ship to the edge of the Dyrix Veil, a region of space notorious for its dense asteroid fields and chaotic gravitational anomalies. To most, it was a death trap. To Elias, it was home. The ship wove through the jagged rocks and shimmering dust clouds, its hull groaning under the strain of the volatile environment. Finally, they emerged into a pocket of calm, a hidden station built into the side of a massive asteroid. The structure was old and battered, its lights dim, but it exuded a sense of security. What is this place? Leora asked as they docked. An old smuggler's hideout, Elias replied. No one comes here unless they know how. As they disembarked, Leora took in the station's interior. It was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, dimly lit by flickering lights. The air smelled of metal and stale oxygen, and the hum of ancient machinery filled the silence. This isn't exactly cozy, she remarked. It's not supposed to be, Elias said, leading her deeper into the station. It's supposed to keep us alive. Uneasy allies. Inside a makeshift command center, Elias activated a console, bringing up a holographic map of the galaxy. The Syndicate's reach is vast, he said, gesturing to the glowing red zones. But even they have blind spots, places they don't want to go. And you know these places? Leora asked, stepping closer. I know enough, he replied. But it won't matter if we don't figure out why they're after you now. Me? She echoed, frowning. I thought you were the target. I was, Elias said. But after our little stunt, you're on their radar too. And trust me, they don't just put bounties on people for fun. Leora studied the map, her mind racing. Then we need to figure out what they want, and how to stop them. Elias smirked. Now you're starting to sound like me. A risky plan. As they worked through potential strategies, the station's comm system crackled to life. Incoming transmission, the AI announced. Elias exchanged a wary glance with Leora before activating the console. The screen displayed a fragmented image of a hooded figure. The voice that followed was distorted but urgent. Elias Kane. Leoravesh, I have information you need. Who are you? Elias demanded. A friend, the figure replied. If you want to survive, meet me on Ravik 9. And come alone. The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, leaving a tense silence in its wake. It's a trap, Elias said flatly. Probably, Leora agreed. But what choice do we have? Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're really bad at staying out of trouble, aren't you? She smirked. You're one to talk. Into the unknown. Despite their reservations, they prepared to leave the station. The journey to Ravik 9 would be dangerous, but the promise of answers was too tempting to ignore. As the ship powered up, Leora glanced at Elias, her expression resolute. If this goes sideways, she began. It will, he interrupted, his tone wry. She chuckled despite herself. If it does, we fight, together. Elias nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Together. As the ship launched into the void, the weight of their mission settled over them. They didn't know what awaited them on Ravik 9, but one thing was certain: their fight was far from over. And the galaxy wasn't ready for what they were about to uncover. The shifting sands of Ravik 9. The desert world of Ravik 9 stretched out below them, an endless expanse of ochre dunes and jagged black ridges that shimmered in the oppressive heat. The ship's engines hummed softly as Elias guided it into the planet's atmosphere, his hand steady on the controls. Lyora sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the desolate landscape. "This is where our mysterious friend wanted to meet," she asked, skepticism lacing her tone. "Looks that way," Elias replied. "Can't imagine it's for the scenery." The ship touched down on a rocky plateau overlooking the dunes. The landing site was marked by a single metal spire rising from the sand, its surface corroded by centuries of wind and grit. As the engines powered down, a tense silence filled the cockpit. "You think it's a trap?" Lyora asked, breaking the quiet. Elias gave her a sideways glance. "Doesn't matter. We go prepared." A desert greeting. They stepped out into the sweltering heat, the sun blazing down on them with relentless intensity. Lyora adjusted her visor, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The air shimmered with heat waves, distorting the distant dunes into surreal, shifting shapes. "Stay close," Elias muttered, his rifle slung over his shoulder. As they approached the spire, a shadow detached itself from the structure's base. The figure was cloaked in layers of dark fabric, their face obscured by a hood and mask. They raised a hand in greeting, their movements slow and deliberate. "You're braver than I expected," the figure said, their voice muffled but calm. "And you're vaguer than I hoped," Elias shot back, his grip tightening on his rifle. The figure chuckled softly. "Fair enough. Call me Kale. I'm here to help." "Help with what?" Lyora asked, crossing her arms. Kale glanced around, as if wary of unseen eyes. "The Syndicate. They're after more than just you. They're after something you have." A mysterious revelation. Kale led them into the shadow of the spire, where the air was marginally cooler. Pulling out a small holoprojector, they activated a display that showed a series of interconnected star systems. One of them, marked in red, pulsed ominously. "This is Oron's next target," Kale explained, "a system rich in a rare mineral known as galvarite. It's used in advanced weaponry and starship engines." Elias frowned. "And what does that have to do with us?" Kale pointed to a second point on the map, a faint, glowing blue dot. "Because you hold the key to stopping him. The Syndicate believes you possess knowledge, technology, or something they need to unlock the galvarite deposits." Lyora's brows furrowed. "That doesn't make any sense. We've been on the run, not hoarding secret technology." "Not knowingly," Kale said. "But sometimes the most valuable secrets are the ones you don't realize you have." Ambushed in the dunes. Before they could press Kale for more information, a distant rumble echoed across the desert. The ground vibrated faintly, and a shadow passed over the dunes. Elias instinctively raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We've got company," he muttered. From the crest of a nearby dune, a squad of Syndicate operatives emerged, their sleek black armor glinting in the sunlight. They moved with precision, their weapons trained on the spire. Kale cursed under their breath. "They must have tracked me." "Or us," Elias said grimly, stepping in front of Lyora. "Time to move." The operatives opened fire, and the air crackled with energy bolts. Elias and Lyora dove for cover behind the spire's base, returning fire with sharp, calculated bursts. Kale moved with surprising agility, darting between the rocks and using their own energy blade to deflect incoming shots. "We can't hold them here," Lyora shouted, her plasma staff sparking as she struck down an advancing operative. "I'm open to suggestions," Elias called back, his rifle blazing. Kale activated a hidden panel on the spire, revealing a narrow hatch. Inside. "Now." The descent below. The three of them slipped through the hatch just as the operatives closed in. The narrow passageway descended into darkness, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights. The sound of muffled explosions above told them the syndicate wasn't giving up easily. "This better not be another trap," Elias muttered as they hurried deeper into the structure. "It's a way out," Cale replied. "You're welcome." The passage opened into a cavernous underground chamber, its walls lined with ancient machinery that hummed faintly with residual power. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the scorching desert above. "What is this place?" Lyora asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. "An old research facility," Cale explained. "Abandoned long ago, but still useful if you know where to look." Elias surveyed the room, his expression skeptical. "You've been here before?" Cale nodded. "A few times. It's safe, for now." An uneasy alliance. As the tension began to ease, Lyora turned to Cale. "You said we hold the key to stopping the syndicate. What exactly does that mean?" Cale hesitated, their eyes darting between her and Elias. "It means the syndicate isn't just hunting you for revenge. They think you have access to something they need, something hidden deep within your past." Elias's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for riddles." "It's not a riddle," Cale said firmly. "It's a reality. If we don't figure it out, they'll keep coming, and they'll tear the galaxy apart in the process." Lyora exchanged a glance with Elias, her determination solidifying. "Then we'd better start figuring it out." Elias nodded, his expression hardening. "And if the syndicate wants a fight, we'll give them one." As the echoes of their resolve filled the chamber, the weight of the path ahead settled on all three of them. The syndicate's reach was vast, their power immense, but together they had a chance to tip the scales. For the first time in years, Elias Kane felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. The hidden code. The hum of ancient machinery echoed through the cavern, its rhythm steady and unyielding, like the heartbeat of a forgotten era. Lyora leaned against a rusted console, her eyes scanning the dimly lit chamber. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The syndicate was closing in, and whatever secrets Elias Kane held seemed to be the only thing standing between survival and annihilation. Cale worked at the console, their hands moving deftly over the glowing keys. This facility was built during the early days of interstellar exploration. They explained, a haven for scientists experimenting with technologies far ahead of their time. "And you think something here will help us?" Elias asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Cale didn't look up. "Not something. Someone." Before Lyora or Elias could ask what that meant, the console emitted a soft chime, and a hologram flickered to life in the center of the chamber. It was an image of a human, an older man with weathered features and sharp eyes, his expression frozen in time. "Greetings," the hologram said, its voice clear and steady. "If you're seeing this, then humanity's legacy is in danger." The legacy of humanity. Elias stepped closer, his expression hardening as he studied the hologram. "Who is this?" Cale's tone softened. "Dr. Elias Marin, one of the last great scientists from Earth before its fall. His work was legendary. Some say he held the key to reversing the planet's collapse." Lyora glanced at Elias. "Elias Marin, any relation?" Elias's jaw tightened. "Not that I know of. Kane's a common name." The hologram continued, seemingly oblivious to their conversation. "This facility contains fragments of a code, an algorithm designed to unlock the potential of Galthreet. With it, entire civilizations could thrive. Without it, they'll tear each other apart in the pursuit of power." Cale turned to Lyora and Elias, their voice urgent. "This is what the syndicate wants. They believe one of you holds the missing piece." Lyora frowned. "How could we have something like that and not know it?" "It's not as simple as carrying a key," Cale replied. "It could be genetic, an inherited memory, or even subconscious knowledge from exposure to certain data." Elias shook his head. This sounds like a load-off. Wait, Leora interrupted, her eyes narrowing. What if it's tied to your past, Elias? The battles, the experiments, something they did to you. He hesitated, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. If that's true, we don't have time to figure it out. The Syndicate isn't going to wait for us to connect the dots. The race against time. The sound of distant explosions rumbled through the cavern, shaking the walls. Kale cursed under their breath. They found us. Elias grabbed his rifle, his instincts kicking in. We need to move. Now. Kale pointed to a door on the far side of the chamber. There's an escape route through the lower tunnels. It'll take us to a landing site. As they made their way toward the door, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that the hologram held more answers. She paused, turning back to the console. Wait. There has to be more. Elias glanced over his shoulder. Leora, we don't have time for this. We can't leave without understanding what we're up against, she shot back. Kale nodded, typing rapidly on the console. I can extract the data, but it'll take a minute. A minute we don't have, Elias muttered, but he held his position, his rifle trained on the entrance. The explosions grew louder, the sound of Syndicate operatives breaching the facility echoing through the halls. Leora stood beside Kale, her plasma staff at the ready, as the console hummed with activity. Almost there, Kale muttered. Just a little longer. The enemy advances. The first wave of Syndicate operatives poured into the chamber, their black armor gleaming in the faint light. Elias opened fire, his shots precise and unrelenting. Lyra moved beside him, her plasma staff slicing through the air with deadly arcs. They're not letting up, she called out, her voice strained. They never do, Elias replied grimly. Cal's voice cut through the chaos. I've got it. Let's go. They bolted toward the escape tunnel, Cal clutching the small data core retrieved from the console. The tunnel was narrow and dark, the sound of their boots echoing as they ran. Behind them, the Syndicate operatives gave chase, their shouts and footsteps growing closer. This better lead somewhere good, Elias muttered. Cal smirked, despite the tension. Trust me, you'll love it. The final stand. The tunnel opened into a massive cavern where an ancient shuttle rested on a hidden platform. It was battered and worn, but it looked spaceworthy. Get in, Cal shouted, running toward the ship. Elias and Leora covered their retreat, holding the line as Syndicate operatives swarmed into the cavern. The fight was brutal, each move calculated, each strike deliberate. The Syndicate outnumbered them, but Leora and Elias fought with a ferocity that kept their enemies at bay. Elias, Leora shouted as she deflected a bolt aimed at his back. Go, I'll cover you. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Don't take too long. As he sprinted toward the shuttle, Leora unleashed a final burst of energy, creating a barrier that slowed the advancing operatives. Then she turned and ran, her heart pounding as she reached the ramp. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and as they lifted off, the cavern below erupted in chaos. The Syndicate operatives fired after them, their shots harmlessly ricocheting off the shuttle's shields. The path forward. As the shuttle ascended into the void, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Cal plugged the data core into the ship's console, and a series of encrypted files began to unravel on the screen. This is it, Cal said, their voice quiet but triumphant. The key to stopping the Syndicate, and maybe saving the galaxy. Elias leaned against the wall, his rifle still in hand. So now what? Now, Leora said, her voice steady, we figure out what they're so afraid of, and we use it against them. Elias smirked, the faintest glimmer of admiration in his eyes. You've got guts, Captain. I'll give you that. She met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. And you've got the scars to prove you're worth following. As the shuttle disappeared into the stars, the three of them knew their journey was far from over. But for the first time, they had a chance, a fragile, desperate chance, to change the galaxy's fate.